So before we get back to our password program, let's look at the basics of what a counted loop looks like. In C#, a counted loop is called a for loop. And the reason why it's called a for loop is because it uses the keyword for. And that really roots from the English that we use when we start to describe the loop, which you'll see in a few seconds. So the syntax for a for loop is pretty simple. It needs 4 parts, and the first part it needs to do is set up a starting value, and the starting value really represents, because we're counting from a point to an end point, so from a start value to an end value, and we're always testing to see that we are less than that end value, or within that start and end value range. And so the way we do that is we need some variable to store our counter variable. So I'm just say int counter. Now we're not going to give it a starting value at this point. That comes later on. So now we get into the actual syntax of the for loop itself. So I'm going to use the keyword for, and now I'm going to open my bracket. Now there's 3 parts in here. The first part is giving the counter a starting value. So let's just, for simplicity's sake, let's give it a starting value of 0. Counter is equal to 0. And then I finish that with a semicolon. And now I need to go to part 2. And part 2 is my test condition. So just to go over this, and so part 1 is starting value. Part 2 is a test condition. So to do this, we want to say, okay, I want to keep looping as long as counter is less than a certain value. So let's say I wanted to loop 10 times. So I want to keep looping as long as counter is less than 10. So the loop will continue forever as long as counter is less than 10. Think of it kind of like an if statement. If counter is less than 10, do this code. In this case, we're going to keep looping as long as counter is less than 10. And then I have our third part. And the third part is our counter increment. So this is how much we want to change the value of counter by each iteration of the loop. Now, if you remember, one iteration means one cycle of the loop, all the code within itself actually executing. So in this case, I'm just going to add 1 to the value of counter. So I'm going to say counter is equal to counter plus 1. If you remember the shortcut, you could also just use counter plus plus. It's the same as counter equals counter plus 1. So I'm just going to open and close our brackets, and then whatever code we put inside here will repeat itself each iteration of the loop. So let's do something simple. Let's just do console.writeLine. Oops. Oh my goodness. Hi. So this, if we run our program, let's count to see how many times we see hi show up on the screen. Oops, I guess we need a console.readline, so we can actually see it. Now if we count these, we see that it shows up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Exactly 10 times. So we started at 0, and we incremented counter by 1 each iteration of the loop. And then after that iteration, it would check to say, hey, am I still less than 10? If I am, I will go in through the loop. Sorry, not after the iteration, after the increment. So the way the code works is when it first reaches this for statement, it assigns the value 0 to the variable counter. After that, it says, hey, is counter currently less than 10? Yes, it is. It's 0. So it will immediately go into the code. Once it finishes executing the code inside the for loop, it'll come back up to the for statement and then run this part, part 3. Counter equals counter plus 1. So if counter was starting at 0, then it would now equal 1. And then it comes back here. It says, hey, is counter currently less than 10? Well, now its value is 1. But yes, it is still less than 10. It'll continue to do so until eventually counter is 9. And then it says, okay, add 1 more to counter. Now our counter is 10. And then it'll do the test again. Is 10 less than 10? No, it's not. So it's done. So it leaves that part and goes down here. So in actuality, counter held the values 0 through 9 every time it looped effectively and actually went into the code. Now we don't have to put just nonsense in here. We can actually use that counter variable. Maybe I want to output the value of counter. When we run this program again, we can actually see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We can actually see the value. Maybe we want to do something else with this. Maybe we want to show the 2 times tables from 0 up to 9. So we could say something like this. 2 times the value of counter. So whatever one, the current value of 2 times with the current value of counter, sorry. The first time, 2 times 0, which is 1, then 2 times 1, which is 2, and so on and so forth. So if we run our program right now, we get 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, which is exactly what we would expect. So you can actually use this variable as well within our code. So this is the basics of what a for loop looks like. So again, step 1, we set up the starting value for our counter variable. Step 2, we test to see if that counter variable is less than some end value that we're looking at. And then step 3 is we have to change the counter variable. This is the most important part. If we don't change the counter variable, then essentially it will go on forever. If we just say counter is equal to counter, for example, we never actually change this, and we run our program, you can see that it's continually just going and typing 0 forever. It doesn't ever go past 0 because we never incremented the value. And you can see that it's actually going on forever. We have the scroll bar over here. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop because we are now stuck in an infinite loop. It's going on forever. It'll never reach this end condition. So that is the basics of what a for loop looks like.